my first probably question would be is evolution, and I just wondered what your general thoughts on that was. I'm presuming that's something you don't believe in.
Are you talking general evolution or special evolution?
That's right. That's the question I was going to ask, because we would hold to the special theory of evolution: point mutations, natural selection, lateral gene transfer, change in allele frequency, all that good stuff that's actually observable in scientific laboratories and out in nature. We would have no problems with fossils, rock layers, none of that stuff. We'd have no issues with that. But when it comes to the idea of universal common ancestry, the idea of the general theory of evolution that the bird, the bat, the banana, the baseball player, and the bacteria all came from a simple single-celled organism or colonies of those organisms 3.4 billion years ago, we would reject that on the basis of zero scientific evidence. The second reason would be scripture, and the third reason would be philosophical problems with those positions. That's a good quote. By the way, you're welcome here, and we're glad to have you here, my friend. I just wanted to throw that in there by way of a warm welcome.
So can you, when you say general evolution, I mean, the kind of the basis that the Earth is very, very old. You know, the current feeling is it's 13.6 billion years old, and this is a long time. And in terms of the change of species, the fossil record, the fact that very simple forms of life are very old and newer forms of life are more complex. So I appreciate it's very difficult to actually show someone the change that happens, and it does test the mind to a point to imagine something like someone like a human being to come from a cell or a mineral or a combination of reactions, etc. Is that something that makes sense to you?
One of the reasons you notice that I gave three reasons. Number one, we believe it doesn't fit with the evidence. Number two, it contradicts theological standards that we would hold to, namely the Judeo-Christian scriptures. And number three, and this is one of the biggest problems, is that neo-Darwinian theory is built on, as is any scientific theory, is built upon logical fallacies. Let me give you an example. The most common one that is often ignored is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. And here's how it goes. It's the idea that if evolution is probably true, we would expect to observe homology. Homology is, for instance, a frog has 5 fingers, a radius, a ulna, a scapula, a clavicle. We have 5 fingers, a radius, a ulna, a scapula, humerus, collarbone, just like the frog does. And so they would say, see, common design or common morphology, common structure, similar structure demonstrates and is consistent with, is evidence that is just added to the pile in support of evolutionary theory to show that we came from a common ancestor. And so they would say, okay, therefore evolution is probably true, most likely true, or the greater preponderance of evidence is consistent with one of those being homology, that evolution is the case. What we say is, no, that's a logical fallacy. If P then Q, Q therefore P. No, that's called affirming the consequent, and that's been long recognized as a fallacy. And atheist, secular, and humanist philosophers of science have long pointed this out. Started with David Hume, and this type of reasoning behind scientific investigation, as far as it's related to cosmology and the origin of life, really took off after the Enlightenment. Before then, scientists didn't engage in this type of thing to the extent that it is now. They didn't engage in these tissue of logical fallacies, but that theory in and of itself can never be true simply because of the fact that it's built on at least 3 logical fallacies: the fallacy of affirming the consequent, the problem of induction, and then the third one is empiricism. Empiricism is fatally flawed. But the first one is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. You cannot determine what's true simply because of mere inductive observations. Just because we see cells changing and adapting to their environments today, and we see organisms doing the same through the process of speciation, natural selection, geographic pressures, artificial selection, whatever that may be, that does not prove that we all came from a rock. The came from a rock part, the Miller and Urey experiment part, the primordial soup argument, the organic soup stuff, all of that is a tissue of conjecture. That is all essentially humanistic philosophy and in some senses humanistic religion, or at least it functions in kind of a quasi-religious way for some humanists, some atheists, some skeptics, but not all of them. They just say, it's just science. But you got to understand, based on a logical fallacy, you can't prove evolution's true. You can't even show that it's likely to be true, just simply because of the fact that it's based on the fallacy of affirming the consequent.
That's true. I mean, it is. Yes, it's technically a theory. Evolution is technically a theory. I mean, obviously, you seem to have looked into this a lot, and
oh yeah.
But I could say then, it's the best we've got. I mean, and in terms of, yes, okay, there's certain things that we can't actually prove absolutely, but it's going to be very difficult to do that without kind of observation and kind of coming up with an understanding of what did happen, and that's where we're at the moment. Now,
right.
But I could say the alternative that you're giving is also something that is difficult to prove, not logical, and so this is my quandary here. How can you say that on the one hand about evolution, that you can't believe it because you've got no proper evidence, even though there's a good amount of evidence to presume or to kind of think, well, this is the best kind of answer that it could have been.
Right.
On the other hand, you're saying some kind of supernatural or some kind of force, some kind of being of some kind made it all in what way we don't know.
Right, and that's a great point and a great question. A couple of things with that. The first thing that I would say was that you can't really know how anything went down as far as the origin of the universe, the planet, or life unless you have an all-knowing being that told you so. Apart from that, all you're left with is induction, and induction's never going to get you to absolute capital T truth about the nature of reality, the nature of metaphysics, as you've already conceded, and any honest person, any honest scientist would concede that this is just a working theory, and all it's doing is trying to make sense. It's trying to give explanatory power to all the facts. And I'm going to bite the bullet here, and I think that neo-Darwinian theory, on the most part, does a pretty good daggone good job of that. And I don't disagree with 90 to 95% of the science that's behind evolutionary theory. Where I disagree is where the conjecture jumps in and there's no hard scientific evidence to back it up. When we start getting into supposed transitional forms and things of that nature, that's when we're going out of science and we're getting into conjecture. Because the problem with the fallacy of affirming the consequent is that the evidence, there are no brute facts out there. So you mentioned that, hey, we've got a lot of evidence to back up evolution. Well, you got to understand, creation scientists with PhDs and intelligent design advocates, they've got the same training, they've got the same evidence that the evolutionary biologist does, but they interpret the evidence in mutually exclusive and contradictory ways. Why? Because the facts don't speak for themselves. One of the first things you'll learn in the philosophy of science is there are no brute facts. If you'll read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he talks about these paradigm shifts that have taken place in science over the last 1,000 years or so, and he says the paradigm shifts take place for primarily one reason. It's when different prevailing philosophies combined with new additional gathered data from the scientific disciplines overwhelm the prevailing previous philosophy, and the paradigm changes. And so what that ultimately is telling you is exactly what I've said earlier, that science itself doesn't tell you what is capital T the case truth when it comes to the nature, scope, an extent of reality. All it can do is show you what works. And I think in many senses, neo-Darwinian theory works, but you have to understand that creationists, they take the same material, the same information, the same data, and they use it to do the same operational science that the evolutionists do. They work in the labs and they do blood tests. They do DNA testing. They build automobiles. They will launch a space shuttle. The worldview at hand, as far as engaging in actual practice of science and making it useful for subduing the earth and making it a place more beneficial for human flourishing, that in and of itself, everybody's using the same tools, the same stuff. But when it comes to the issue of origins, the reason why the interpretation is so different is not because there's not evidence that's consistent with either view. I think there's evidence that is and can be interpreted in such a way as to be consistent with the prevailing philosophy of, say, long eons of time in evolutionary history. But there's also evidence that's easily interpreted and consistent with a younger age of the Earth and universe and with a creationist paradigm. The issue is, what is the interpretive framework that you're going to bring to the table to interpret that evidence? And that's fundamentally why people come to completely different conclusions about these things. Because, again, to sum it up, the facts don't speak for themselves. Every fact is an interpreted fact and not a brute fact. Does that make sense, Alan?
Sure, absolutely. And as I said, I mean, science for me and for many people I speak to, and just reading about science, is not about absolutes. It's about, and I'm sure you're aware of this. I'm just coming from my point of view. Science is just observing, looking at things, and coming and kind of making sense of it. It's not something that says this is true, this is not true.